Hello, welcome to another one of my Alteryx data videos. In this video, we're going to take a look at another example of how data might be consolidated into a flat file when it's being exported by a developer and sent to you. Developers typically have tools that they use to export data, so everything that they export they try to fit into that tool, and sometimes the data that they're sending to you is a bit more complex for you to decode, but not really so much complex for them to send to you. It would be nice if you could work with your developers to send the data in a format that's easy to read, but they just tend to like to ignore your requests and send you the data the way that they see it best. Also, sometimes there are standard EDI, electronic data interchange, that defines how the data is being sent to you. A lot of these are very archaic in that they've been around for 20, 30 years, but data is still sent according to that structure, and it also will include some of this more complex data. The example of data that we're looking at today, I'm going to show two different versions of it and how we can utilize Alteryx to read both of them with very minimal fuss. The first set of data, and both of these data sets are about puppy training sessions, is more of a typical EDI structure in that what we have is some identifying information for the record. In this case, it just happens to be the puppy ID. And then we have repeating groups of data, each which defines a training session. And it can have anywhere from 1 to 7 to 10 of these, depending upon the data set that you're looking at. And it's up to you to have to translate these. In this case, each of these tuples of data happens to be the training date, the trainer ID, and the charge amount that the puppy would have for that session. The data within the tuple is separated by a comma, and each of the tuples is separated by a pipe. So what we will want to do is to turn each of these single records into multiple records, that is a single session. The same data presented in a slightly different format is more likely to come from your development team, which is where all of the columns are separated by a column and they're not actually identifying the individual pieces of the repeating groups. So it's up to you to translate these. So simply starting out with a workflow where I have already gone and pulled in that data, ran it, so you can see that by defining the data as flat text data, it will simply bring in each record as a raw text string with no subfields within it. Both of these sets of data are brought in that way, and you can see the difference between them here. Get asked the question, why don't I just bring this in as delimited data? Well, there's a problem with the first one in that there is two different sets of delimiter, and a problem with the second one in the fact that they are variable length records as far as the number of fields are concerned. So if I was to bring this data in with an input data widget, and I connect it to one of my sets of data, in this case example 1, it is a delimited text file. It is separated with commas, for example. Does not have field names. Click OK and run this. You see we get an error because Alteryx has made an assumption that every record is going to have the same number of fields. So when we got to record 2, it goes, wait a minute, there's more fields out here than when there were in record 1. So this is why you will be required to continue the processing of this data manually. So let's take a look at how we're going to build this. We'll build these two work sessions one at a time in the same workflow, just so you can see the differences between them. So once I brought my data in this first example, we'll go ahead and slide this to the side to give me workroom here. What I want to do first is to separate this data by the pipe, and that means I will get a ID field and then a field for each of the training sessions. The nice thing about using the text to columns widget is that it handles multiple fields quite easily. So I want to split field 1. I want to split it into a number of columns, and I'm just going to choose 8 as an arbitrary number, knowing that my data is actually much less than that, but it's a good validation, and that it is, and also I can see that my extra data will be put into the last column. We'll call this data for its root, just for cleanliness. Run this, and look at the output that comes out. And you can see that this is the original data, data 1. Whoop, we used the wrong separator. We used a comma. Sorry about that. Let's go put the pipe in there. Run this again. Much better. There is our puppy ID, the tuple for each of the sessions, and we can see that 7 is completely null, so I'm only having to deal with a few, in this case 5, of the specific fields that have data in them. So the next thing we want to do is go ahead and split this data out. And we'll go ahead and use the transform widget. If you look through the icons, you can see that underneath Transpose is a widget that will take columns of data and split them out into rows. So what I want to do with this is take each of the puppies, which is data 1, as my key column, and then I want to split out 2 through 6 into separate records. Turn off 7 and 8. Running this now, we can see that I have my puppy ID, the specific records that they came from as a name, and then here are my tuples of session to work with. We can quickly separate this data out because all of these that have a null value are not needed, and we'll do that with a filter. And in that filter, we will only want to keep the records whose value is not empty. Empty is being used for text. Run that. Now we have just the data that we need. Want to follow this up by again separating out these individual pieces of data into columns, and we will go back to our parse with our text to columns. Dropping in up here, we want to split value. And we'll go ahead and choose multiple columns to break it into. We know there's 3. We'll do 4 just to make sure that there's something not unusual within this data set. Run this again, take a look at it, and you can see now that for each record of data, I have the date, the trainer, and the value of the session, and then we also have 4 that is empty. So the last thing that we'll want to do within this data set is to clean it up. Use that within the select. We no longer need the name nor the value. We also do not need value 4. Data 1 is an integer. It is the puppy ID. Value 2 is a date. It's the session date. Value 2 is an integer. It's the trainer ID. And finally, value 3, I'm going to call that fixed decimal, 10.2, because it's the session amount. one last run of this. Look at the final data set. You see that we have successfully separated out by puppy ID each of the sessions, so that now this data can go into my data lake so people can analyze this data and create some fact tables or other reporting structures from it. Again, straight line, very straightforward. It's just knowing how to put the widgets together. So let's take a quick look at the second set of data. Again, let's go ahead and drag this to the side. We won't need it right now. And we're going to again start out with our text to columns. And here we want to separate everything out by commas. We have a lot of data here, so let's go ahead and just choose 30 just to make sure everything is clean. Run through this, look at the output, and you can see that what we've done is, we forget to give it a root name. Makes it easier to talk about the columns. There we go. So the actual field has been broken into multiple columns of data, numbered 1 forward. We scan to the right to see where we end our data out. We see that 17 is where the data begins to be all null, so there are 16 columns that we need to deal with. Each 3 sets of columns is our tuples that we need to break into separate records, but we want to group them. Well, Alteryx has created a widget for us to do that with as well. It's called the Arrange widget. And what we do with here is that we identify the key field, which is data 1. Sliding back here helps us look. So data 1 is our ID. And data 2 begins the repeating groups. So what I will need to do here in column dropdown, I want to add a column. That column is going to be the session date. And it happens to be 2, 5, 8, whoops, 9. Get this math going right. 2, 5, 8. 8 was right. Thinking and typing at the same time is not the best thing to do. 8, 11, and 14 identifies our 3 session dates in this record. We have one column identified. We need to identify the second column in this group. Add another one. We'll call this trainer ID. It starts with column 3 by looking at the data. Going up by 3s, we've got 3, 6, 9, 12, and 15. There's our second column of the tuple. And then the final piece we will add as well. It is called session amount. It starts with 4, 7, 10, 13, and our final column of 16. Click on OK. We can run this. And sure enough, when we look at the data, you can see that we've broken it out into our ID and our 3 values. We're going to go ahead and drag session ID over here to select so that we can get rid of the description and change our data types. Data 1 is our integer 32, which is the puppy ID. Session date is a date. Trainer ID is an integer. And session amount will be our fixed decimal in .2. And at the output data, it looks clean. We just have to get rid of these nulls. So let's get rid of that. Use session date to get rid of the null columns null records that we don't need. Preparation, we'll pull in our filter. Drag this in as well. So what we want to do here, and for the basic filter, is say session date is not null. Run through that. See that our data's come up clean. Comparing the two sets of input and output, you can see that it's the same results. Something else to look at all the time, but to check on, if you notice in the metadata, it gives you an idea of what the source is of this field, and if there's any description that passed along the way. So it helps you from a documentation standpoint, seeing that it was parsed out. Nice to know. Anyway, so now we've looked at two unusual formats of data, each that include a repeating group within them, showing you really how simple it is to parse this data out within Alteryx using a variety of different widgets. One of the key takeaways from this video is that you should not be afraid of unusual sets of data that you're coming in, especially if they're flat files or even if they're embedded inside of columns in a database, which I've seen as well. Alteryx has a lot of tools that allow you to separate the data out and to create clean rows of data that you can further process, putting them into a database, using them for reporting, whatever you need to do with them. So don't be afraid of exploring. As always, any comments about this video, let me know. Especially let me know if you have some unusual data formats of your own that you might need some help in how to translate. Like the video if you find it useful. Subscribe so you can see the videos as they come out. So have a great day.